Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the horrifying Von Manor, where Roger and myself will be talking about the 500 book challenge. Yes, the 500 book challenge, a terrifying thing in itself, where I will be reading 500 books before I buy any new ones, or before Roger buys any new ones. Neither one of us are going to buy any new books until I've read 500 books. And at the time of this recording, I've already read 5. Woohoo! Only 495 to go. No problem. So today we're going to be talking about some of the books I'll be reading for my 500 book challenge. These are the horror books, some horror books that have been sitting around in the dark corners of Von Manor waiting to be read. What books are they? This is one of them. This is Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons. So this was sent to me a while ago by Ryan from Book Time with Ryan, a fantastic channel you all should watch. This is one of his favorite books. He bought himself a new fancy pants edition of this and wanted this to go to a good home, but instead he sent it here. Oh well. I said I would read it and I have not. So yeah, definitely have to read this one. This is a high priority. Yeah, here it's fantastic. It's long, but that's okay. This 500 book challenge is going to be going on for the next 6 or 7 years anyway, at the speed I'm reading them. So that's one thing. But now let's get to some classics of literature, of horror literature, starting with Mary Shelley. I've got 2 volumes of the supernatural and weird fiction of Mary Shelley. This first volume, of course, has Frankenstein, which is really practically the only thing I've read from Mary Shelley is Frankenstein, but she wrote a bunch of other stuff. So this has Frankenstein, and it has 14 short stories of the strange and the unusual. So this will count as one book, and you don't have to twist my arm to read Frankenstein again. And I definitely want to read those 14 strange stories, so this will count as a book. And this will count as another book. And this one actually has The Last Man by Mary Shelley, a kind of weird science fiction-y type of story, as far as I'm aware, about, well, the last man. I guess a disease has wiped out everybody else. At least I think that's what happens. I've always wanted to read that, and now I'm going to, and it's in this volume, along with 3 short stories of the strange and the unusual. So that's going to be cool. Mary Shelley. And speaking of classic horror, it's Arthur Machen. Now, I've read a lot of Arthur Machen, but I haven't read all of the fiction of Arthur Machen. Not all of the fiction of Arthur Machen is actually horror, but I do want to read it all. And so here's my chance, because I've got the 3-volume set of the collected fiction of Arthur Machen, which was published by Hippocampus Press and edited by S.T. Joshi, the great editor who did so much work with H.P. Lovecraft and other horror writers. So this is Volume 1, 1888 to 1895. Then we've got Volume 2, 1896 through 1910. And Volume 3, which has 1911 to 1937. So 3 books for my 500 book challenge from Arthur Machen, which is his complete works, actually. And speaking of classics, here's a classic, Dracula by Bram Stoker, which I've read a gazillion times, but this is the Norton Critical Edition with all kinds of extra stuff in it, which was kindly sent to me by David Wiley. Thanks, David, for this copy of the Norton Critical Edition of Dracula. What else is in here, aside from the authoritative text of Dracula? We also have contexts, a few essays about the context of Dracula, current reviews and reactions, so reviews from 1897, a bunch of reviews from that time, when Dracula first came out, dramatic and film variations, so some essays about plays and movies, I guess, about Dracula, and we have criticism on Dracula and some other extra stuff on top of that. So you got Dracula and a bunch of other stuff in this volume. So that's cool. The Norton Critical Edition of Dracula. Thank you, my friend David Wiley, for sending me that. He sent me that a while ago. And as far as old-timey stuff, here's another book, Don't Dream, the collected horror and fantasy fiction of Donald Wandrei. Donald Wandrei was a contemporary of H.P. Lovecraft. His stories are usually pretty good. So, yeah, Don't Dream by Donald Wandrei. Fantasy and horror. So, gotta read that. And speaking of old-timey stuff, how about some Richard Marsh, The Seen and the Unseen? And this is going to stand in for some other Richard Marsh stuff. I've got a bunch of Richard Marsh on my Kindle. He probably could have gone in with my Victorian episode the other day, but I forgot to put in Richard Marsh. Sorry, Richard Marsh, I know you're dead, you don't care whether I read your books or not, but I do need to read some more Richard Marsh, and this is supposed to be a collection of strange short stories. Richard Marsh, the famous author, not so famous anymore, of The Beetle, the horror novel that came out about the same time Dracula did. So there's that. And we have a bunch of other stuff sitting around here as well, like Blackwater by Michael McDowell. Blackwater. This originally was published in several parts, but this has the entire novel all in one book. And it's a beautiful book. Blackwater. Look at that. It's just gorgeous. It's beautiful, from Malcolm McDowell, the great paperback original writer who wrote so much cool stuff. And I never read the whole of Blackwater. Have intended to for a long time. Pretty much I've been talking about reading this since I started my channel. And now I'll finally have a chance, so this is going to be one of those 500 books that I read. Blackwater. Yay! And how about some Ramsey Campbell? Ramsey Campbell with The Parasite. Look at that creepy kid. Hey, I had to have at least one book with a creepy kid on the cover, and this is Ramsey Campbell's The Parasite. This is supposed to be pretty darn good. And I have this one that I bought fairly recently, which is a later collection from him. I think this came out originally about 10 years ago. Just Behind You by Ramsey Campbell. Just Behind You. That's a cool cover. So I've got that. I'm up for reading more Ramsey Campbell. And now I've got some books that were sent to me a while ago by Juan Valencia of Plagued by Visions. Yes, the famous Juan Valencia who wrote this, Poking Holes by Juan Valencia. Now I do have a physical copy of this book that I have to read, but it was stolen by the lady of the manor. She stole my copy and now it is at her workplace. And it's okay, she could steal it and read it for a while because it's worth it because of her shocked expressions and gasps of horror. She literally gasps out loud reading this book. I mean, she was sitting in bed last night. And the lady of the manor, I always thought was pretty hard to shock, but man, Juan's been messing with her head with this book. This book must be intense. Whew, it'll probably send me to the padded room if it has that effect on her. So yeah, good job, Juan. But Juan, aside from writing this fantastic book, sent me a bunch of books that I still need to read. One of them would be this. This is The Dark by James Herbert. I just read The Fog last year by James Herbert. I've got a couple other James Herbert books on my Kindle, I believe. I think I have The Rats, which I have read, but I've never read this one. So The Dark by James Herbert. Hopefully it'll be as good as The Fog. I'm not sure it will be, but we'll see. And then Juan sent me a bunch of books from this cheerful guy, Jack Ketchum. Jack Ketchum, who wrote this happy book, The Girl Next Door, which is supposed to be just some fluffy, happy saga. Some wonderful, happy story. It's actually supposed to be pretty depressing and sad and terrifying and disturbing, which is what you would expect. The Girl Next Door. I'm a little worried about reading it, but I'm going to read it. But I also have all these other books from Jack Ketchum, like, what else do I have? I've got Off Season that Juan sent me. Off Season, I think this is Jack Ketchum's first book. I've never read a Jack Ketchum book, so I gotta catch up. Off Season from Jack Ketchum. And then I've got Offspring. And I've got The Lost. Something called Peaceable Kingdom. I bet it's not all that peaceable. This is just a guess, but Peaceable Kingdom. And something called Cover. With this guy who's pointing this shotgun at that lady. That's not very nice. That's not nice, Jack Ketchum. So there's all that. Also, I should say that I am going to be continuing with my reading every book by Stephen King. I'm taking a hiatus from that at the moment because I'm doing my Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive. But as soon as that's done, I'm going to be catching up with Stephen King. I have all the Stephen King books up through the 80s and into the 90s. I don't know that I have all the 90s books. And I'm halfway through the 80s now. So we'll see how far I go with Stephen King in publication order until I run out of Stephen King. But I've got a few. I've got quite a few, actually. Most of them I have on Kindle, but I do have some physical copies. And Juan sent me this as well. Thanks again, Juan. What a nice fella, sending me all this stuff. Also, speaking of sending me stuff, Weird House sent me all of these books. Weird House did. I didn't expect any of these books, but Weird House sent me these books. Like here's Inspector Lestrade and The Black Temple and Other Stories by William Michael. This one actually was Black Heart Boys Choir by Curtis M. Lawson. So I should read these since they were sent to me. This one I'm actually really looking forward to because it's Lovecraftian, and I love Lovecraftian stuff by Tony Richards. The Howling Terror and other Lovecraftian horror stories. That's going to be cool. And speaking of stuff I need to read, I didn't read this at Halloween like I was planning on. This is Lurking in the Dark, a HorrorTube anthology, which has a bunch of your favorite booktubers who are also HorrorTubers, and Steve Donahue's in here writing the introduction. So this has some cool stuff in it, I'm sure, and I'm definitely going to prioritize that because I've wanted to read that already. And I've got R. St. Clair, and Code Red. Code Red. I really enjoyed her book, Women in Trouble, which I read for Horror Mayhem last year, so I might save this for Horror Mayhem in 23. We'll see. We'll see. Excellent cover. This looks pretty good. Okay, some other stuff now. Man, I've got a lot of horror, dudes. I've got a lot of horror. So, Eric LaRocca, You've Lost a Lot of Blood. Still haven't read it. Bought it a while ago. Still haven't read it. So I'm late on my LaRocca. I've actually got a couple books from him that I haven't read that are waiting. This book has always been one of my favorite books since I read it. But this is Why Not You and I, a collection of pulpy horror stories from Carl Edward Wagner. But I realized the other day that I haven't read this book in over 20 years. So maybe I'll read it now and I'll think it'll suck. So I need to reread this just to see if it's still as high in my estimation as it was when I first read it. Because that was a while ago. It was way over 20 years ago, actually, when I read this. So I got to read this one. This one is cool. Also, this one is one I've been wanting to read. Shadows with Eyes, 6 Tales of Crawling Horror by Fritz Leiber. Actually, Ramsey Campbell has said some very nice things about this particular collection. And look at that cover. How can it be anything other than great? So there's that. There's this one, Of One Blood or The Hidden Self by Pauline Hopkins. This is a book from the Haunted Library of Horror Classics from the Horror Writers Association. This is one of their publications. This was originally serialized in Colored American Magazine in 1902 through 1903. So this looks really interesting. An uncanny tale of identity, race, and spirituality by the groundbreaking Black author Pauline Hopkins. So yeah, this sounds really cool. So I want to read that. That sounds really interesting. Speaking of Ramsey Campbell, he helped put this together with Stephen Jones. This is the Best New Horror anthology, which just looks really cool. It's got that old style EC Comics look. Want to read that one. Also, I was thinking of going through the Anno Dracula books. I read the first couple of them, maybe 3 of them I read, but I never read all of them. But I do have them all either on Kindle or in paperback. And then I've got this fancy pants Anno Dracula edition of the first novel. So, vampires. Can't go wrong with vampires. Oh, I should have held this up when I was talking about my classic-y stuff. Look at this. This is William Hope Hodgson. And I'm going to be reading all of these collected editions. This is The Boats of the Glengarrick and Other Nautical Adventures. I've been meaning to talk about these books for ages and about this author for ages, but I feel like I need to give him a more current look again. This is another writer that I haven't read for decades. Regularly, anyway. I picked up a couple of his books since then, but I haven't read all of his stuff for a long, long time, and never all at once. So, yeah, my plan is to go through all my volumes. I think I have, 5 volumes of this? The collected works of William Hope Hodgson. So, yeah, there's William Hope Hodgson right there. Go through all of those. Then I've got this big beast, which I've been meaning to read for 2 years now almost? But it's so huge, it keeps getting pushed out of the way by other booktube events and things. But I'm finally going to read it, The Dark Descent. One of the greatest anthologies ever of horror. I've read it, but I originally read it in 3 volumes. There were 3 mass market paperbacks that came out. And so I didn't read it all at once. I kind of read these mass markets as I picked them up. But this is the whole thing. All 3 of those mass markets were put into this one Dark Descent anthology by David G. Hartwell, and it's fantastic. But it wasn't big enough for Hartwell, so he came out with a sequel volume, The Foundations of Fear. So 2 massive horror anthologies. So 2 books for the 500 books. But wait, there's more. I've never read Poppy Z. Bright. Here's Drawing Blood by Poppy Z. Bright. I have read Poppy Z. Bright, but not much, just in an anthology here and there. But I've never actually read a whole Poppy Z. Bright book, so here's one. I still haven't read Autumn Gothic by Brian Boyer. Autumn Gothic, this is supposed to be another cheerful, happy book, but I wanted to read this because I hear good things about it. Here's an interesting book that I found in a little free library, actually, shockingly. Shadows Bend, a novel of the fantastic and unspeakable. This is a novel by David Barbour and Richard Raleigh, and I don't know if either one of them ever wrote anything else. But this is a horror novel about H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard fighting Cthulhu. At least as far as I understand, that's what it's about. So how bad could it be? It sounds amazing. Then I've got this book, which I got recently, Monsters Unleashed, which has a bunch of stories from a lot of great writers about classic monsters. I've got a random paperback of Dagon from Fred Chappell, which I want to read. It's got this really super creepy step back cover there. Want to read that one. I've also got Occult Detective Magazine, number 8, which I've been intending to read, and it is over 200 pages long, so I'm going to pretend that this magazine is actually a book, because it really is kind of a book. So yeah, Occult Detective Magazine. This was sent to me, so I feel like I should read it. As were The Angry Dead by Rosemary Pardo. This was published by Cat Haven Press, who also does this. So at the same time I got that, I got this. The Angry Dead by Rosemary Pardo. Got to read that. And I've got to read this one, The Solemn Curfew and Other Dark Tales by Bev Allen, also by Cat Haven Press. But wait, there's more. There's Incubus, This is a novel by Ray Russell. Ray Russell, who has a couple Penguin classics. I've read one of them, Gothic. I've read all of his Gothic tales. And that was excellent. That was published by Penguin. I read that for Horror Mayhem. This looks pretty trashy, so I almost read it for Garbogust, but I don't know if it's Garbogusty enough. But I definitely need to read it. Incubus. And I've got a couple cursed books. This one's pretty cursed. This is Panzer Spirit by Tom Townsend. Panzer Spirit. I still have to read it, guys. I still have to read it. Along with Witch House by Evangeline Watson. Both of those were sent to me by Coffee Cats and King, another fantastic channel that you should watch. This was originally published by Arkham House, I believe, years and years ago. And I'm not sure if there ever was another paperback edition of Witch House. I don't know. I need to read it, though. And finally, we're going to end with Brian Lumley. I've been reading the Necroscope books, and I've got Dead Speak. I've got to read Dead Speak next. I've read the first 3, now I've got to read Dead Speak. The continuation of the Necroscope saga. But I also have a couple other Lumley books, like this creepy book, Fruiting Bodies and Other Fungi. Fruiting Bodies and Other Fungi. That's on my TBR. And this very shiny, shiny book, The Whisperer and Other Voices. The Whisperer and Other Voices. So we'll close out with Brian Lumley. That's a lot. I was going to add my horror books that I have on Kindle to read, but this is enough for today. This is a lot of books. So there you go. I'll shut up now. Whew. Roger, why'd you make me do all the talking? Anyway, I will catch you next time.